It is with great pleasure that we welcome Jodi Dean as our keynote speaker for this conference. Professor Dean is a political theorist and professor in the Political Science Department at Hobart and William Smith Colleges in New York, and author of more than 10 books. Her work has engaged with a wide range of topics within political and critical theory and cultural and media studies, from feminist politics, democracy and empire, to the entwinement of cultural forms with shifting political and economic modalities of neoliberalism. Her recent work has engaged even more directly with questions of politics and resistance in 21st century capitalism. In addition to being replete with razor-sharp analyses and interventions, Professor Dean's oeuvre, even in its engagement with abstract theory, embodies a model of academic thinking that responds to the critical imperatives of our time and exudes a resolute emphasis on the urgency of the political struggle for a world beyond capitalism. This commitment has also recently made Professor Dean a target of brazen institutional repression. As many of you know, she has been recently suspended from teaching by her institution in response to her piece on Palestinian resistance in Verso blogs. This despicable event is part of a broader attack on voices within academia which dare to dissent from the status quo of purported neutrality, apathy, or explicit alignment with the aims of US imperialism and Israeli colonization. Academic repression around Palestine reveals the key role of universities in perpetuating the capitalist economy of war and the military-industrial complex, even more so with the increasing corporatization of higher education, which Lisa referenced in her comments, which is part and parcel of the many changes wrought by neoliberal capital that we will be discussing over the next 2 days. This, in fact, brings us to Professor Dean's talk, which is titled Becoming Neofeudal, Changing Laws of Motion on the Social Manor, which illuminates precisely some of these shifts that capital has been undergoing. So without further delay, I'd like to now welcome her for the keynote address.
All right, so thank you all so much. I'm really happy to be here. It's a big deal to speak in something that was organized in Lauren's honor. I agree with Lisa. I mean, I found her scary and enchanting and stimulating and wonderful. She liked my cat. We don't have the, and so it's a loss. But also we all have benefited from her work, and so that's important. Thanks to Anna Cyril Jones, who did all sorts of detailed work to help me come, and I really appreciate the invitation and the work and the remarks from Arwa and Hadil. This. I think when we contextualize this also in terms of the scholasticide that's happening in Gaza, to have academic spaces it's a luxury and it's a privilege, and it also shouldn't be just for the benefit of neoliberal capital either. I, like so many of us, only saw the what was happening here in Chicago via various social media, and I just felt like, oh my God, these student commentators have said more and better than anybody I have heard in months and months and months. Like that, the moral seriousness and leadership is just it's just completely inspiring. And I agree with Hadil. I think it can be a turning point for a global left against imperialism. So my remarks are going to focus on this transitional time that Hadil mentioned. Lenin viewed, can y'all hear me okay? Yeah, Lenin viewed transition as the economic essence of imperialism or moribund capitalism, characterized by the domination of monopoly and finance capital and the territorial division of the world among the leading capitalist powers. Imperialism names a period where different modes of production coexist, even as they are compelled to follow the same economic and political logics. As Lenin observed, in this stage, certain features of capitalism change into their opposites. What he had in mind was their transition towards socialism. What we see in today's moribund capitalism is another tendency, a tendency towards something that looks a lot like feudalism. Capitalist laws of motion are reflexively folding in on themselves and becoming something no longer recognizably capitalist. Processes long directed outward through colonialism and imperialism are turning in on themselves in ways that undermine capitalist laws of motion and repeat accumulation strategies typical of feudalism: rent-seeking, plunder, and political control. Indeed, Lenin observed that a prominent tendency in imperialism is the creation of the rentier state, the usurer state, in which the bourgeoisie, to an ever-increasing degree, lives on the proceeds of capital exports and by clipping coupons. In the imperialist epoch, in other words, holders of capital start acting more like landlords than they do like capitalists. So it's important to be clear on what we mean by capitalism. I follow Ellen Meikson's Wood when she emphasizes that the specificity of the capitalist mode of production stems from how market dependence compels certain forms of behavior, namely competition, accumulation, profit maximization, and increasing labor productivity. Right? So I don't think, and I don't know if anybody thinks, but you can't just define capitalism by giving a list of like, oh, there's bourgeoisie, there's laborers, there's workers, there's means of production, right? It's important to look at the logics or the laws of motion. And so this is why I'm following Ellen Meikson's Wood on this. She explains that the capitalist system as a whole is uniquely driven to improve the productivity of labor by technical means. My claim is that the imperative of accumulation under conditions of the declining rate of profit, or secular stagnation, if you prefer that language, that this is bringing capitalist laws of motion into contradiction with themselves, reshaping society and politics in the process. Profit, improvement, and competitive advantage no longer dictate accumulation strategies. Instead, rents, destruction, and hoarding combine with extra economic coercion in a social formation driven by privilege and dependence. Two sets of laws, right, economic laws, two sets of laws are operating as capitalist laws compel non-capitalist behavior. Capitalist relations and forces of production are undergoing systemic transformation and transitioning into a different mode of production, and I call this mode neofeudal. Now, I develop the idea of neofeudalism in order to synthesize the effects of 40 years of imperialist neoliberalism. And in the long version, I emphasize these four different attributes: parcellated sovereignty and its concomitant elimination of the distinction between the economic and the political. You can also think about this as new forms of suzerainty, but I'm not going to go into those that today. The second set of attributes include new lords and serf, or you would call this changes in social property relation. Also hinterlandization, or the particular spatialities of prosperity and destitution, and then the everyday psychosis of catastrophic anxiety, or the affective environment of neofeudalism. So, to be clear, I'm not saying that capitalism is dead, right? That's the difference between my view and Mackenzie Wark's and Yanis Varoufakis's. What I'm saying is that it's transitioning. And transition can last a very long time, and the character of what is being transitioned into is neither fixed nor certain. Attention to capitalism's neo-feudalizing tendencies lets us see a direction that the transition is going, but it's not fixed, it's not definite. So what I'm going to do in my remarks today, they're divided like into three sections. I'm going to start by providing the economic context for the neo-feudalization hypothesis. And then I'm going to address the critique of current ideas of neo-feudalism and techno-feudalism. It's mostly associated with Yevgeny Morozov. And I'll just show why he's wrong. And then I'll draw out one of the most important differences between the techno-feudal thesis and the neo-feudal thesis, and that has to do with the servant economy and the service sector. Okay, so I'm talking about the general economic context. Recent work by non-Marxist as well as Marxist scholars brings out the dynamics underlying neofeudalism. The data sets and categories of analysis differ, but they point to the same combination of intensified inequality and accumulation uncoupled from production. So most well known is Thomas Piketty with his 2014 book, Capital in the 21st Century, which demonstrates that wealth inequality increases under capitalism because the rate of return on capital is higher than the rate of economic growth. Simply put, wealth accumulates at a rate higher than wages rise. Since wealth is concentrated in the hands of the few, the distance between those with wealth and those reliant on earned income expands. The expression, rate of return on capital, points to the rents that can be extracted from existing assets. So rent here refers to more than the payment demanded by monopoly control over land, right? It refers to more than what landlords make us pay. It includes the fee or payment commanded by monopoly control over any asset. For example, financial instruments, digital platforms, and intellectual property. So that's the first, one set of analyses about the present that lead in this neo-feudal direction. In the same vein, Brett Christophers presents rentier capitalism as a system, quote, not just dominated by rent and rentiers, but in a much more profound sense, substantially scaffolded by and organized around the assets that generate those rents and sustain those rentiers. The ethos of a system where rentier relations predominate is, quote, proprietarial rather than entrepreneurial. So basically, I think the whole thing about entrepreneurialism that was a big deal, 10 years ago? That was just a ruse. That was a trick, right? Just to get everybody, anyway. Okay, so accumulated wealth generates more accumulated wealth and pushes a reshaping of the economic system toward accumulated wealth. That is to say, rents. Taking, not making. Finally, a third version, Robert Brenner. Brenner offers a compatible explanation for the intensification of inequality, the declining rate of profit. Since the 1970s, capital's growing difficulty in generating profit by investing in means of production and employing workers to make commodities has led to alternative accumulation strategies. The one Brenner highlights is the upward redistribution of wealth through political means. Rather than operating as capitalists who acquire wealth by investing in production, the already wealthy pursue political strategies to force social wealth to themselves. These strategies don't involve seeking advantages that will give them a competitive edge. They aren't about growing the economy or baking a bigger pie. They're about taking a bigger piece. Pointing out the error involved in reading neoliberalism as an intensification of competition, Brenner argues that, quote, what's essential here is the opposite of competitiveness. It is access to special privileges that directly yield wealth thanks to political position or connection, end quote. Bluntly put, the players aren't winning in the markets. They are using extra economic power to change the game. The accumulation strategy is political. Brenner lists tax cuts, privatization, intellectual property, failure to enforce laws against monopoly, wealthy people collecting interest on government debt, which increases because the government finances itself by debt rather than taxes, and the rise of the financial sector, which is no doubt the main lever of the new political economy of upwardly distributing wealth through political means, end quote. Brenner's analysis evokes the merger of the economic and the political characteristic of neo-feudalism. Rather than simply using political means to acquire competitive advantage in the markets. Oh, wait a minute, I just said that. Sorry. Okay, so I just said that, skipping that. Okay, so the dynamics here are global. The rate of economic growth is slowing down across the capitalist systems. The delinking of capital accumulation from production is a general phenomenon in an uneven system, that is to say, an imperialist system with players who are not evenly matched, who have enormous differences in strength wealth, technology, and the capacity to violate international law with impunity. When some win, others lose. For example, China's economic growth in the first decades of the 20th century occurred in the context of low rates of worldwide economic growth. The market share of Chinese firms increased while that of other countries, the US, Brazil, Mexico, and South Africa, declined. And I'm relying on Aaron Banana for that point. Accompanying China's industrial success and compounded by its economic slowdown around 2013 was the deindustrialization of poor and middle-income countries throughout the world. Already facing de-agrarianization, severe indebtedness, and weakened state capacity as a result of the structural adjustment policies, countries such as Argentina, Brazil, Iraq, Nigeria, and Venezuela decomplexified their economies and resorted to exporting raw commodities, particularly natural resources like oil and gas. While commodity prices were high, these exports could fund significant poverty reduction measures. In states without the requisite popular mobilization and political will, export proceeds fed the luxury consumption of elites. When prices drop, though, millions are pushed into insecure, informal service work. And I'm relying there on David Oakes and Henry Williams. So capitalism produces inequality. In an imperialist epoch, holders of capital pressure states to facilitate and protect their seizure of the social product, globally and domestically. Deeply imbricated in finance, these holders of capital hoard their assets rather than invest in production. Corporations buy back stocks and reward their executives, in effect, feeding the consumption of the rich instead of putting money into improvements, growth, or the labor force. It's worth noting that the Lord's consumption was a primary driver in the European feudal economy, and for some analysts, a primary explanation for that economy's relative stagnation. At any rate, with the intensification of private equity and leveraged buyouts, much of the investment that occurs today is oriented toward conquest and destruction, the over-celebrated disruption of entire economic sectors. Capitalism's dynamics are neo-feudalizing, transitioning into an economic system that no longer follows capitalist laws of motion. Okay, so you might be thinking, right, capitalist power in an imperialist system is bad and immiserating, but hasn't it always been this way? Hasn't it always relied on predation and conquest? And does neo-feudalism add anything that we don't already know? Yevgeny Morozov's critique of techno-feudalism lets us explore this question. Morozov dismisses all the language of feudalism, all the feudal references. He dismisses all this as meme-hungry intellectual laziness, as failures to understand digital capitalism, rather than as insights into the possibility that capitalism might be transitioning into a political and economic form no longer aptly described as capitalist. An underlying suspicion is that the very idea of neo-feudalism or techno-feudalism, that it's covertly conservative, that it's a sneaky way of saying that capitalism is actually not so bad, and therefore we should do everything we can to shore it up. Cedric Durand puts this insinuation to bed. He's like, look, there's no covert shoring up of capitalism going on in the techno-feudalism idea. If commodity production continues to drive capital accumulation, then the Marxist critique still applies. If, however, accumulation depends on rents, predation, and plunder, then attention to neo-feudalizing tendencies lets us, quote, grasp and fight the emerging forms of social domination. My point is that both are true at the same time. Periods of transition are marked by the overlap of competing forms and logics. Morozov's critique, though, is really useful insofar as it pinpoints the role of extra economic coercion in capital accumulation. He highlights a central question. Does capitalism require violence? Or is capitalism an economic system with a logic irreducible to violence? Clarity on these questions is crucial for any account of neofeudalism. We can't understand what capitalism might be changing itself into if we can't say what's distinctive about capitalism. For Morozov, the choice is between Marxists like Brenner and Wood, and then on the other side, the other choice is Emanuel Wallerstein's world systems theory. Marxists generally conceive feudalism as expropriation driven by extra economic, coercive, or political means. Lords expropriate surplus from peasants over whom they exercise juridical power. Capitalism differs in that it's a relation of exploitation. Surplus is extracted by economic means. Deprived of the means of subsistence, nominally free workers are obliged to sell their labor power for a wage. In order to survive in a cash economy, to sell their labor power for a wage in order to survive in a cash economy. In contrast, Wallerstein argues that capitalism also relies on extra economic coercion, most profoundly the coarse expropriation of surplus from the periphery. So Morozov sides with Wallerstein. And he faults accounts like Brenner's and Wood's for conceiving capitalism too narrowly in terms of the laws of motion arising from specific social property relations, particularly these social property relations that compel innovation in production. Morozov thinks that this narrow conception leads Brenner and Wood to consign a whole slew of activities necessary for accumulation to a separate political sphere, and that this prevents them from acknowledging the inextricability of racism, patriarchy, colonialism, and state violence from capitalism. More broadly, Morozov argues that exploitation-centric approaches to capitalism are pushed to employ extraneous concepts like predation, dispossession, extraction, rentierism, and neofeudalism in order to understand the present. And he's like, shouldn't we just have an expanded notion of capitalism? Now, I think there's a problem with Morozov's argument. If capitalist exploitation is unthinkable apart from expropriation, if it is inextricable from violent taking, then the primary difference between capitalism and feudalism breaks down. What Morozov does, so like you can't see a difference between them. What Morozov does then is claim this breakdown for capitalism by viewing, and he does this by viewing capitalism as always already expropriation. Well, this forfeits the very ability to distinguish it from feudalism, right? There's not a difference between the modes of production that matters. And that's not a conceptual advance, right? It rejects the fundamental premise of Marx's entire project, which identified changing forms of class relations. So Morozov prevents us from identifying any kind of change in form. Heaps of accumulated wealth are not capital. Taking, seizing, pillage, plunder is not production, it's redistribution. Capital is a relation not identical with brute force. As William Clare Roberts underscores, violence and theft cannot give rise to capital directly. There must be a displacement from the acts of violence and theft to the process of capitalizing upon the conditions thereby created, end quote. That capitalism is historically accompanied and reinforced by coercion does not make capitalist processes indistinguishable from direct and violent expropriation. So one could actually just as easily claim the breakdown between the breakdown of the difference between capitalism and feudalism for feudalism. Right? Insofar as accumulation has never not involved violent expropriation, we've never been capitalist, right? Feudalism never ended. Importantly, feudalism as expropriation is not the whole of the Marxist story. Exploitation doesn't simply replace extra economic coercion, it accompanies it. Capital incorporates and relies on previous economic and social forms. A set of new laws of motion comes to overlay prior relations of production. Marx recognized the coexistence of different economic practices. His distinction between formal and real subsumption mobilizes this coexistence. As Harry Haroutunian argues, Western Marxists' preoccupation with the completed process of real subsumption, that is, with technical improvement in labor productivity, has led to the neglect of capital's continuous encounter with and absorption of non-capitalist elements, that's the process of formal subsumption. What Morozov presents as a necessary but as yet undeveloped model of capitalism bringing together expropriation and exploitation is already present in Marx, and not simply in the origin story of primitive accumulation, but more centrally and profoundly in the continuous process of formal subsumption, whereby capitalism metabolizes its exterior. Formal subsumption points to capitalism's dependence on elements it absorbs but doesn't generate, elements produced through any number of non-capitalist labor processes. Morozov emphasizes that dispossession and expropriation have been constitutive of accumulation throughout history. His dissolution of the difference between feudalism and capitalism in favor of eternal expropriation fails to attend to changes in the forms of exploitation. So he naturalizes capitalism in a way already effectively criticized by Wood, and he thereby abandons any effort to recognize and specify system change. Marx understood that the compulsion to perform surplus labor is not unique to capitalism. Pre-capitalist economic formations associated with communal ownership, such as slavery and serfdom, and of course both continue to exist under capitalism, these also compel labor to produce a surplus that the master and the lord expropriate. Capitalism changes the form of this compulsion. What was a direct and personal form of domination becomes impersonal domination mediated by the market. Market pressures induce owners to find ways to get workers to do more, work harder, produce more surplus value. The question of neofeudalism and neofeudalization is whether we are seeing another change in form. For Morozov, capitalism is moving in the same direction it always has been. But might not movement in the same direction lead to falling off a cliff? Or, put in the old-fashioned terms of dialectical materialism, can't quantity turned into quality? Although Morozov doesn't explain what he means by capitalism's direction, his gesture to the neofeudalism discussion as, quote, making the strange argument that capitalism is somehow moving in reverse, end quote, this suggests that he actually presumes a linear, progressive notion of history. Conceivably, we're already at the end of history since capitalism is infinitely adaptable. All that will ever happen is variations on the same. What Morozov fails to consider is whether capitalism's own dynamics can transform it into something else, something worse, something we need to identify and oppose. The neofeudalism thesis is that capitalism is doing precisely this. Its laws of motion are coming into contradiction with themselves, compelling behaviors that are not capitalist. Okay, so now I'm going to move to the service sector and the servant economy and the differences between thinking in terms of techno-feudalism and neofeudalism. Technology writers have long used feudal metaphors to describe the impact of networked digital communications. In 2010, in the influential and prescient book You Are Not a Gadget, Jaron Lanier discussed newly emergent cloud computing in terms of lords and peasants. He identifies as the inventor of virtual reality gaming. And so he discussed these, already in 2010, he was talking about cloud computing in terms of lords and peasants. The lords own and control platforms and data. The peasants are the rest of us who have become dependent on the platforms. We may own our instruments of labor, laptops, phones, cars, but someone else, the platform lord, is the conduit or means through which we access the market, charging a fee and collecting data about our transactions and use. Now, increasingly, we don't even own these objects, right? We finance or lease them, paying not for the item, but for its use. Writing just a few years after Lanier, Bruce Schneider, a network security expert, concluded a list of the nefarious dealings by Facebook, Google, Apple, Microsoft, Twitter, and LinkedIn by pointing to a shift in power to IT. IT's dramatic increase in power, he said, was indicative of a digital feudalism. He warned, if you've started to think of yourself as a hapless peasant in a Game of Thrones struggle, you're more right than you realize. These are not traditional companies, and we are not traditional customers. These are feudal lords, and we are their vassals, peasants, and serfs. The massive amounts of data and computing power necessary for AI are said to be stored in the cloud. But what's the material structure of the cloud? Servers. A few powerful tech companies own massive server farms that everyone else, right, companies and governments, as well as individuals, that everybody else pays to access. And what these servers store is actually us, the social substance, the general intellect, all the data that our lives and interactions generate. Really, we're the servers. Anyway, most recently, Yanis Varoufakis and Cedric Durand have offered powerful arguments for why the system in which we find ourselves is best understood as techno-feudal. Feudalism is not a metaphor. It's an operating system for the present. Now, I agree with a lot of what they are saying. I've got a lot of overlap, but they overlook something that's important and crucial, namely the ways that the neo-feudalizing tendencies in communicative capitalism show up so dramatically in the service sector. I'm not referring here to the replacement of jobs by automation, but rather its opposite, the limits of automation. Jason E. Smith draws out Marx's analysis of the connection between industrialization and the expansion of services. As productivity increases, requiring fewer workers, those in need of a wage to survive are thrown into sectors less amenable to automation, that is, services. Services are less amenable to automation in part because of the specific skills that care work requires, skills like diapering a baby and moving an elderly person from bed. Services also resist automation because they're cheap, the last jobs available to those thrown out of every other avenue of paid employment. As Marx writes in Capital, the extraordinary increase in the productivity of large-scale industry, accompanied as it is by a more intensive and a more extensive exploitation of labor power in all other spheres of production, permits a larger and larger part of the working class to be employed unproductively. Hence, it is possible to reproduce the ancient domestic slaves on a constantly expanding scale under the name of a servant class. Notice how Marx's argument here resists simplistic progressivism. Capitalist industry itself reproduces social property relations characteristic of an earlier economic form. Or differently put, capital's social reproduction is not limited to the social reproduction of capitalist social relations. It can also reproduce non-capitalist social relations of servitude. The majority of jobs today are in services, and services count for the largest areas of expected job growth. This is true all over the world. In high-income countries, 70 to 80% of employment is in services. Most workers in Iran, Nigeria, Turkey, the Philippines, Mexico, Brazil, and South Africa are also in services. Across what David Oakes and Henry Williams call the poor world, large percentages of workers toil in informal, low-skilled service work. Quote, the unlicensed taxi drivers, roadside fruit peddlers, freelance porters, squeegee men and women, beady rollers, beggars, rag pickers, clothing resellers, small-time scammers and thieves, bazaar porters, and general-purpose unskilled jobbers who constitute the majority of the population of cities everywhere from Kabul to Cabinda to Managua. end quote. An effect of simultaneous processes of de-agrarianization and deindustrialization. The production of an enormous surplus labor force enables middle-class households to employ multiple servants and insurgent militias to sweep up restless foot soldiers. Right? So it enables middle-class households to employ servants and then militias to recruit restless foot soldiers. Lacking access to means of subsistence, people rely on debt to survive, becoming easy prey for scammers and predatory finance. Understanding the economy of rents and services as neo-feudalizing helps us make sense of the present. It lets us recognize seemingly disparate economic and social phenomenon as interrelated elements of a single tendency that extends beyond the realm of high technology. Legal theorists are documenting this tendency as a privatization of jurisprudence. Robert Kuttner and Catherine Stone argue that, quote, elites are pursuing something aptly described as a new form of feudalism, in which entire realms of public law, public property, due process, and citizen rights revert to unaccountable control by private business, end quote. Privatized arbitration agreements, platform labor, social reproduction crises, and widespread feelings of pervasive, inescapable catastrophe might seem disconnected. But together, they point to the result of 40 years of neoliberalism, a neo-feudal order with new lords and a sector of servants. In short, neo-feudalizing tendencies involve a whole lot more than just technology. Now, Italian theorists in the 1960s used the term social factory to describe the relationship between capital and labor in the post-war era. Today, we inhabit a social manor. Society isn't oriented toward the production of workers and commodities. It's now an order of personalized service, privilege, hierarchy, and fealty. More and more of the people, forced to sell their labor power to survive, sell this labor as services to those looking for deliveries, drivers, cleaners, trainers, home health aides, nannies, guards, coaches, and so on. The buying and selling of services is enabled by new intermediaries, technological platforms whose owners insert themselves between service offerers and seekers, being sure to exact a fee along with the data and metadata that accompany the transaction. Our basic interactions are not our own. With advances in production seemingly at a dead end, capital is removed from circulation and transformed into assets that, however arcane, might somehow function as a store of value in an increasingly irrational and uncertain context. In many of the so-called advanced economies, class no longer functions as a powerful political identity. The perspective of working people is not associated with an orientation to the future. Being a worker doesn't seem to be, for most people, a source of strength or pride. It's something to qualify, if you want to get that pride part in there, right? Like knowledge worker, cultural worker, tech worker. The weakening of working class identification is typically explained as the result of the capitalist class's sustained attack on unions. That's not wrong, but it's a 40-year-old explanation that doesn't shed a whole lot of light on what's happening to workers now. According to the Atlanta writer George Chidi, quote, people are trying very hard to avoid the word serf, but that's kind of what we are, end quote. What's happening now, and what's been happening over the last few decades, is the rise of the service sector. Ever more workers are employed in services and retail. They've moved from being producers to being servants. In the words of the economist David Autor, quote, there's a lot of people who are there to serve the comfort and convenience and care of affluent individuals, end quote. People may have a hard time identifying as workers because they don't see their work as driving social production and collective energy, right? They don't see their work as carrying a future they believe in. They recognize, perhaps at a kind of inchoate or subliminal level, that their work serves the consumption requirements of the ruling class. Imperialism's constitutive unevenness shapes the neo-feudal servant economy. Here are a few examples. Viewing tourism as a vehicle for economic growth, governments prioritize serving the desires of travelers rather than meeting the needs of their own people, remaking populations of producers, whether craft, agricultural, or industrial, into servants of the privileged. Another example, the Philippines relies on income that domestic workers earn abroad. Nearly 9% of the country's GDP comes from Filipino women serving a privileged global elite. Interactions between governments and corporations also illustrate the international unevenness constitutive of neofeudalism. A report on extractive industries prepared for the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, for instance, highlights the clientelist relations between multinational corporations and African governments. It argues that the dependence of these states on the income generated from extractive resources risks turning them into, quote, rental fiefdoms, where the political elite buys support instead of investing in sound economic policies, end quote. Services are a broad and heterogeneous category, spanning from the highly paid legal and financial retainers who enable asset holders to retain their class privilege, all the way into the enormous expanse of informal and low-waged cleaners, childminders, cooks, and drivers. The upper portion of the service sector identifies with the ruling class, supporting the bourgeoisie, landlords, and other asset holders. The massive lower portion continues to increase. Over the next 10 years, the occupation that will add the most jobs in the US is personal care aides, not health workers, but aides who bathe and clean people, servants. Many people newly pushed into service work find that their phones, bikes, cars, and homes have lost their character as personal property and been transformed into instruments of labor and means for the continued extraction of additional rents and fees. Tethered to platforms owned by others, consumer items and means of life are means for the platform owners' accumulation. Most of us, even most of us in here, constitute a propertyless underclass only able to survive by servicing the needs of high earners. We often find ourselves caught in labor relations where we pay for the opportunity to work. If anybody's ever had to pay, you have to pay to go to a conference. So weirdly, the people who are higher on the food chain go for free, right? Or their institutions pay, but if you're a graduate student, you have to pay like this exorbitant amount. And then like if you have to get a hotel, then the fees are really high. So you pay for opportunities to work. Anyway, so we find ourselves caught in this. Another example of this are self-employed personal trainers. They generally work out of fitness centers to which they pay rents and on which they depend for access to clients and equipment. They take on various unpaid tasks, right, like cleaning up, answering the phones, maintaining an upbeat atmosphere. And they do all that for the benefit of the organization, even as they individually assume the financial risks that come with not having a guaranteed income. Now, some of us enjoy the fantasy that our service work is creative, that we're members of a privileged class of knowledge workers, yet much of what we do is also for free, for the chance of pay, rarely with a chance of security. Knowledge workers, like day laborers, compete for contracts. If we win, then we get to work. Generally speaking, services tend to be a stagnant sector. Productivity growth is slow, dependent more on suppressing wages and pushing workers than on technological innovation. With the bulk of jobs consisting of low-skill, low-productivity personal services, inequality intensifies, the many locked into serving the few. Most of us are minions now, proletarianized neo-serfs tethered to the platforms, apps, phones, and personal connections we need to access basic means of subsistence. The few use their political and economic power to seize ever larger portions of the proceeds of labor, evading public law while subjecting us to their private dominion. We are exploited through the wage that is further expropriated from us via ever-increasing rents, fines, charges, and fees. This economic stagnation is an indication of capitalism's transition into a neo-feudal servant economy. So neo-feudalism, it's not designating the simple return of the feudal form of expropriation. In the so-called advanced economies, the majority of people do not have direct access to their means of reproduction. We require some kind of income that will enable us to purchase what we need to subsist: food, shelter, and means of life. Neo-feudal serfs are proletarianized serfs, free from the land, free from job security, free from social welfare safety nets, and dependent on markets for every aspect of our lives. Although this freedom makes us look like the proletarians Marx described, it's integrated into laws of motion that have little to do with capital's compulsion to maximize profit and increase labor productivity by investing in means of production. Not only do today's proletarianized neo-serfs labor in the low productivity services that have come to predominate in deindustrialized and de-agrarianized societies, but many labor in settings where they're not employed by capitalists at all. They pay for the opportunity to sell their labor to consumers of services. If under capitalism we sell ourselves, under neo-feudalism we pay a fee to access a market where we can sell ourselves. All right, I'm going to conclude. It's a long conclusion. So I've described the economic conditions of neo-feudalization. I've addressed the critique of neo-feudalism, and I've emphasized the importance of the service sector or sector of servants as a feature that makes neo-feudalism more than a techno-feudalism. I'm going to conclude with a brief look at what is to be done. I started with Lenin after all. That is to say, what paths of organizing and resistance the neo-feudal thesis might open up. Growth in services creates a problem for capitalism. Services challenge the value form. Much of the work exceeds value. Ill-suited to commodification, it fails to be confined within the terms of the capitalist circulation of value. For example, the value of care work is immeasurable, even as it rarely commands an exchange value sufficient for its own reproduction. That this work may be necessary for life, but insufficient for capital accumulation, is already spelling the end of capitalism. Faced with growing service economies, asset holders rely on non-capitalist accumulation strategies. This underlying tendency, as I've been saying, this tendency to stagnation, hoarding, predation, and destruction is neo-feudal. If this is even plausible, then our politics should draw out, amplify, and organize the energies of proletarianized servants by linking them with a communist project on a warming planet in an imperialist epoch. The interests of service providers, I don't mean like internet service providers, right? I mean the services, like service workers. The interests of service providers are not in propping up a stagnant system where wealth is increasingly redistributed upwards through political means. On the contrary, our interest is in creating a system of production and reproduction in which people and the planet can thrive. A system that meets social needs by providing universal basic services. I'm going to explain this, but basically the pitch is going to be a servant sector as a vanguard, fighting for universal basic services, because universal basic services is necessary on a warming planet. It can't be some kind of new industrialization. So that's the general shape. A society in which most labor is in services is already oriented toward meeting needs, although the capitalist form prevents it from doing so. At present, as capital's own dynamics are coming under laws of motion no longer recognizably capitalist, these needs are configured within the social manor. The many serve the few. That the current capitalist economy is, like the old feudal one, oriented around the consumption needs of the lords creates specific contradictions. In the US, for example, there were shortages of nurses, even still, even as hospitals closed. And we noticed this during COVID, but in a lot of places, like I live in kind of upstate declining New York, and they're shutting down hospitals all the time, right? There's not only can you not get an abortion within 20 miles of where I live, you can't even have a baby within 20 miles of where I live because they shut down the clinics. In the hospitals, right? You have to go further away. So, we see this sort of this general like capturing of services and care work within the terms of U.S. capitalism. We know the impact of the trapping of of services within the capitalist form. We also see this in the impact on housing, right? Massive shortages in affordable apartments, while a global class of asset holders buys up everything it can. Those who work from home depend on deliveries from those who don't, on those whose working conditions deprive them of access to essentials like toilets. Services are meeting the needs of those who can pay, while those who can't pay are denied them. Ending the domination of the asset holders and tech lords, eliminating the very existence of a class of owners, is crucial for the flourishing of people and the planet. And service workers can be thought of as the vanguard of this struggle. Over the past decade, doctors, nurses, teachers, librarians, warehouse workers, trash collectors, transportation workers, baristas, adjunct professors, and graduate students have been leading the class struggle all over the world. Domestic workers in India, Indonesia, and the US have organized to demand basic labor protections. In the fall of 2020, for example, daycare workers in Ireland, baggage handlers in Italy, hotel workers in Los Angeles, and nurses across 6 US states, these were just some of those in the service sector carrying out labor strikes. So there's a practical material reality behind recognizing service workers as a new leading force in the class struggle. Not only are they actually doing it, but services are a sector where employment continues to increase just as the labor actions are increasing. Communists, or friends of communists should place the provision of universal basic services at the core of our vision for the post-capitalist future. Reindustrializing is not a serious option. The environmental cost for such a strategy on a global scale are far too high. A more viable path goes through services. As Dylan Riley writes, what the planet and humanity need is a massive investment in low return, low productivity activities, care, education, and environmental restoration. In most so-called developed countries, education, transportation, and healthcare are widely recognized as services that government is expected to provide. Most also presume some degree of public cultural support and provision, libraries, museums, and the arts, as well as state protection of natural resources in the form of green spaces, parks, waterways, wetlands, and nature preserves. That people have a right to expect these basic services is an unsurprising, familiar idea, even despite decades of cuts and austerity. This familiarity is part of the power of UBS, Universal Basic Services, as a central component of a communist future. We already know we want it. So we have to invigorate and extend the promise of UBS as the basis for social and ecological flourishing. Staffing such services can provide employment for the millions pushed out of the carbon economy. People can be retrained with an eye toward infrastructural repair, wetland maintenance, land reclamation, and forestry. UBS can solve the problems of the hinterlands, right, these declining areas, and reknit social ties, engaging more people in socially necessary reproductive labor, nursing, teaching, elder care, and child minding. Rather than servants of tech lords, we will serve each other and the well-being of all. Understood as universal, these services can and will scale, extending beyond fragmented subcultures and functioning as basic societal guarantees. Universal basic services, securing the conditions for social reproduction on a warming planet, should be the political horizon for working class struggle today. Given the heterogeneity of the service sector, it wouldn't be accurate to say that this is the spontaneous orientation of all service workers, although the emergence of an ever-growing discourse on care is worth noting. Rather, this political orientation has to be brought in from the outside, as Lenin so scandalously said. A party of organizers, the Communist Party, can use this orientation to link and intensify the struggles. Instead of being servants in the social manor, service workers, including those who do informal and unpaid labor, can be hailed as the collective force ushering in the possibility of an economy based on meeting needs. Just as their work ruptures capitalist value, so can their politics push the revolutionary transformation of society in a communist direction. So I look forward to your comments.
I mean, thanks a lot for the very interesting talk. So I have a question.
Why don't you introduce yourself?
Okay, so I'm Nicolae Buia. I'm a PhD student in political theory here at U Chicago. So I have a question regarding the commodity form and commodities. So in feudalism, neither labor nor land were commodities. So serfs couldn't sell their labor and couldn't really be sold by the lords either, and lords couldn't sell their land. So actually lords and peasants, they were bound together by custom. So there was a sort of decommodification going on. So then, given this, how does this neofeudalism narrative square with another very plausible story that more and more things are becoming commodified, have become commodified in recent decades? And this seems to happen both on the side of labor and capital, right? So I think there's never been a moment in history where more and more people are wage earners than today, right? So over the last decades, like billions of peasants, right, have been transformed into wage earners. I don't know, I mean, I would maybe resist the identification of services with as being somehow intrinsically non-capitalist, right? Because if you're a service worker for Amazon, as a warehouse worker, or you're a nurse for a private hospital, I mean, you're a source of profit. So you work for Amazon, you work for the private hospital, you produce profit for that company, and then from this formal standpoint of the commodity form and the standpoint of profit, you're not really different from a steel mill worker producing profit for the steel mill owner. And even if you're an Uber or delivery driver, right? So maybe you're like formally self-employed, but you're not really different from a like 19th century textile worker who's participating in the putting out system. You're a source of profit for Uber, you're a source of profit for Deliveroo, right? So you participate in the circuits of capital accumulation. So from this point of view, right, you have more and more wage earners than ever, and more people who are exploited for profit than ever in the history of mankind. And then from the side of capital, more and more things have become capital assets, right? So one of the reasons why the rent is so damn high is that like real estate has become more and more financialized. That is, more and more incorporated into so more and more commodified, right? Not more and more decommodified. So more and more integrated into the circuits of capitalist accumulation and profit making. Also, like informality. So I wouldn't say that informal jobs are necessarily somehow non-capitalist, right? So like the formal, long-term, stable work contract, right? That's something maybe which is a 20th century phenomenon. But 19th century workers, right? In Britain, for example, I mean, they were day laborers in a way, right? So they didn't have a formal contract. So their employment depended on the daily whims of their employer. So there seem to be orthogonal questions, right? Whether your employment is formal and whether your employment is the source of capitalist profit. So yeah, I guess, and maybe just something else that came to my mind, right? Like Hayek in the 1940s wrote a book called The Road to Serfdom, right? So he somehow used this feudal language, right? But he used it in the opposite way. For him, the transition from economic form of mediation to a political form of mediation was the return to feudalism, right? So he saw social democracy, like decommodification, as something potentially feudal. So yeah, so basically, just to conclude, I mean, how do you square these questions, right? Like the new feudal narrative with like this hyper-capitalist story of like the commodification of everything, of more and more labor and more capital assets. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. I appreciate those questions. So I'm going to first talk about, let's think about the fact that more and more people have to sell their labor power to survive, right? The question, I think, is are we paid for our labor power for the sake of capitalist production, or are we paid out of the consumption funds of a consuming class? The vast majority of informal work, particularly in, let's just say the vast majority of informal work is paid for out of consumption funds, not for the increase of productivity. So, for example, if I pay someone to rake my yard, I'm actually not doing that as an investment, as a capitalist investment. That's just like the same thing as if I paid someone to do my nails or, paid for pants, right? I'm using my consumption fund to pay for that. So I think it's important to, when we think about the fact that so many people are on, this is why I say proletarianized neo-serfs, is people are dependent on markets, but this market dependence is not going into productive capitalist relations. These are primarily consumption relations. So we've got both things happening at the same time: market dependence plus a disconnect between between accumulation and capitalist kinds of production. So that's my the primary argument. On the Hayek part, it's completely interesting. There are variations on these feudal hypotheses. And I can't remember the name. There's a Russian commentator who has said a lot about the Russian economy and blamed the fact that it's basically a Hayekian argument. Has blamed the primacy of the state as a kind of feudalization there in a way that's a kind of inverse of my argument regarding how capitalist logics are working.
Am I next? Oh, thank you. Thanks very much for that very thought-provoking talk. And I'm following up on Nikolai. I'm Lisa Wedeen. I'm following up on Nikolai's comments and questions. In addition to the kind of hyper-commodification that he was describing, and the kind of reproduction of wage labor, albeit in these informal ways that you're talking about, I was thinking about the way in which the category of neo-feudalism would also imply a kind of revitalization of the kind of face-to-face relations, or a certain fealty that is secured through personal ties. When we think of feudalism, we also think about a certain kind of attachment or set of attachments, a certain kind of temporal framework, a lack of, if I'm following Moishe Stone, a lack of the kind of sensibilities of abstraction that also undergird our current era. And so I'm just wondering whether I'm completely with you that something is changing and that we need to theorize that change. But I'm wondering whether the category of neo-feudalism really captures all of these dynamics, particularly the ones around sensibility, attachment, and, as Nikolai was saying, the kind of hyper-commodification as well.
So it's so interesting that one of the corresponding technological platforms, one of the technological platforms that has emerged as part of these neo-feudalizing tendencies is Facebook, right? Where in fact there's a kind of abstracted an illusion of face-to-face relations, but nevertheless the connections, the personal connections matter. More and more people. I don't want to say more and more people. Let me just say we all experience the need for personal connections in every aspect of our professional lives, right? We need it in our work. We need it to get places. It's not, and interestingly, we also have right now the abstract attack going, the kind of attack on meritocracy happening, which is really saying like, oh, there's no such thing as meritocracy. It's never been meritocracy. It's always been a form of privilege. To my mind, what that critique is expressing is the awareness that we are in a neo-feudalizing time where privilege and personal relations are carrying a weight that at least the self-understanding of capitalist professional society did not have before. And that now it's becoming explicit. The face-to-face aspect of it, the personal dependence aspect of it. In some ways, the academy's always been feudal, right? Like, where it's totally hierarchical. We're like the last remnants or the vanguard, depending on how you want to look at it. So I think also on the personal ties part. God, I wish I could remember the details of this. I talk a lot about this in one of the chapters of the book, but there's Paul Krugman had some really bizarre editorial a couple of years ago. I mean, I should just stop there, right? Where he was just talking about how sort of brutal Trump is to all the people around him, but what Krugman's remarks were taking for granted was that, of course, and the way he put it was something like, even those who were not dependent on him give in or something. And I'm like, oh, so you're taking for granted the fact of personal dependence as involving, necessitating, allowing for these kinds of brutal relations. So I actually think that on the personal front, it's really quite striking and quite strong. And rather than being like I think it's an example that works in my favor, in the favor of the neo-feudalization thesis.
Can I just push back for a moment?
Please.
But there's also a sense of duty and obligation baked into feudal. Sorry. There's also a sense of duty and obligation baked into feudal relations that just, are part and parcel of what is entailed in these personal associations. And I don't see that here in the same way. I mean, I just finished watching Shogun, if truth be told. So my understanding of feudalism has been amplified by that remarkable series. But, the kind of way in which people felt tethered to each other is very different than what we're... So, yeah.
No, good. No, this is really helpful. This is great. So there's a French legal theorist, Alain Soupiat, who has a really... he's not a Marxist, but he's still good to read. I got to say, these days all my best friends are liberal lawyers, so I'm really... But Soupiat talks about a network society as this a society of suzeraincies and a kind of neo-feudalization involving tiny, tiny micro-contracts. Right? So the duty, it's not just this ethical duty that Soupiat points out. He's like, it's tiny contracts, constant contracts for this or for that. It seems to me like I get a new contract on my phone every time I update it, right? I've got to do all of these different kinds of services. The multiplication of contracts, particularly private contracts rather than public contracts. We see this in a really strong sense in arbitration agreements. The majority, when I first heard of arbitration agreements, I thought that was just for Silicon Valley, like tech people or rich people or something. No, in fact, the majority of workers in service sector work actually have to come under arbitration agreements. So rather than being governed by public law, they agree to pursue arbitration in these courts that are actually not even really courts, that are just these, I don't even know what to call them, just arbitration courts that make determinations based on whatever the terms of the contract are. So it's not the ethos may not be there, but the sense of, I am indebted, I am contractually bound, I think is there.
Is there somebody, I took the, okay, yeah.
Oh, now all the hands. Should we take a couple at a time, or are we good?
We have 17 more minutes, so it's up to you.
Would y'all mind if we take two at a time? Is that good? That gives y'all more chance to talk. Or two or three at a time.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm Isa Lappalainen from Uppsala University. I'm a political theory student. So great talk. Thank you so much. It was really, really interesting. And I have a question about the sort of political horizon of the communist promise today. Because if we equate that to like access to universal basic services, that sounds an awful lot to like a social democratic welfare state to me. And does this not reduce the communist political promise to a social democratic one? And is there still a point to make a distinction, or how do you think about that?
Don't you go right behind you?
Yeah, so many.
And then you can pass it to him, and I'll do this. To him right on your same row.
Oh, Daniel. Yeah. Okay, great. Hi, thank you. I'm Sabrina. I am also a political theorist here at the University of Chicago. Thank you for this very interesting talk. My question also has to do with sort of the promise of reorienting the communist project or the project of Friends of Communists towards the provision of universal basic services. And I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate more on how you think the provision of these services might do more not only to redirect investment away from the rich and towards the poor, but also to redirect investment in a way that upsets the racialized and ethno-national hierarchies, which we know are reproduced in the context of organizations as micro as the school or the hospital, the sites where the provision of such services would ostensibly take place. And of course, when we think about, moving beyond capitalism, destroying the structures of capitalism, we understand it to mean also those structures of racialized hierarchy. So how do we sort of incorporate that project as well, or how do you see us doing that into the sort of project that you lay out?
Hi, I'm Daniel Epstein. I'm also a political theorist here. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I think my question picks up on some aspects of Lisa's and maybe Sabrina's also, in that I'm interested to hear you say more about sort of neofeudalism, not simply as economic form, but political form, and specifically sort of what you see as the sort of place of the state in the story that you're telling. I mean, one important difference, right, between the world we live in now and the first feudal world, if you want, is that we live in a world that is organized according to the nation-state form and other kinds of cognate sort of collections of nation-states, et cetera. And so how that works in your account, I'd like to hear more about.
Okay, can I go with those three, and then we'll do a next round? So thank you all for these. I don't think it's just social democratic because no more property, right? Like, so abolition of private property, like. Okay, so there's that, and then so it seems to me that by revaluing, and now I mean valuing in the moral way, not the capitalist way, by revaluing labor that has been racialized and gendered, by now seeing that as the leading task, the primary task, the most important, significant task for all of our well-beings and the well-being of the planet, that we start to address the combinations of racialization that have been deeply embedded in capitalism. So by valuing the labor, we're also revaluing the people who do that labor. So there's an intrinsic part so it's a kind of deeply embedded aspect of this transformation of the understanding of the role of service work in the world and for the future. So that's the first part. And then on the state. So do you know this great book by Quinn Slobodian? It's his newest one on zones. And something capitalism, cracked capitalism. So what I love about that book is, of course, because it affirms my thesis, right? It's always a good way to find books. But the way he's looking at the fragmentation and the lack of sovereignty. This, to me, is the way things are going. That's the tendency. So there is a change in state form around towards suzerainty, fragmentation, and against the kind of and this the nation state's present, obviously, but it's self-fragmenting. and it's changing. So that's the way I would go on the state form. But one thing, like I also think, Tony Negri, may rest in power, was always thought that sovereignty is the problem. I think that's wrong. I think it's the absence of sovereignty as the problem. Okay, so we'll start there. Oh, sorry. Wait, okay.
It's for the recording. It's not.
Oh, okay.
We'll come. Sorry.
So I don't know if you've read Arlie Russell Hochschild's book from 2016 called "Strangers in Their Own Land: American or Anger and Mourning on the American Right." But one of the findings that she discusses is that people who are most down on their luck are also most severely in opposition to any form of redistribution, and that they associate it with government corruption and a type of kind of cheating on those who have fairly been waiting in line for the American dream. That's how a lot of people think about it. So I guess my question is, how do you summon the political will for the project that you're proposing?
Thank you for the wonderful talk. My question actually builds on Nikolai's initial question. So what I heard in your response to the commodification aspect of capitalism was that there's a dissociation between wage labor and extraction of absolute surplus value in this kind of service economy, because the wage labor is coming out of the consumption fund. Then I was wondering, how would you think about this idea of absolute surplus value in a neo-feudal model? And if you see a hierarchical relationship between different forms of surplus extraction, I'm thinking of rentier and industrial form of labor here. And my second question is with respect to the category of rent. And I'm thinking with somebody like Radhika Desai here, who would argue that rent is not a feudal category. Rent, because land is not alienable in feudalism. So the relationship between the serf and the landlord would be one of feudal dues and not of rent. So like how, just your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Hi. Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm Purnama. I'm a PhD student in anthropology at Stanford. Thank you for the talk. My question is also kind of related to Nikolai, but more on the side of psychopolitics of neoliberalism, as Byung-Chul Han calls it. I mean, along with the extraction or the coercion that goes on, how do we reconcile a sense of freedom that is experienced in these settings? Like, for example, the way in which people value some amount of flexibility while acknowledging that, okay, we're not being paid fair wages, but for example, people who work out of their homes, piecing together small objects, products, still say that at least we can work at home. So the experience of some amount of freedom and how we would place that within this diagnosis of neo-feudalism.
Okay, great. I think that was 3. I'll take these. Yeah, all right. On the summoning of the political will, honestly, I think that I blame the left on the fact that many working people in the United States have so much reject socialist ideas. I think that that's a failure, that the political failure is on the side of organizers who gave up, who may have compromised too much. I mean, obviously the Democratic Party is hopeless, and that's a big part of the problem. But even on the when there's intuitions and grassroots things that only demonize working class people as sort of inextricably or naturally conservative, I think that's a problem. I think that through education and outreach and being there and building, that you can summon the political will. You can't take it for granted that it's already there, and it's a project, and it's not easy. So that's the way I would answer that one. like, doggone it, I actually don't know this Radhika Desai book, and or argument, and so I kind of wish I didn't hear about it, because it's going to, like, mess up some stuff, but really late in the game. So I'll just have to say I don't know. I'll have to look at it. In much of the Marxist tradition, obviously not Desai, rent is a feudal category, and so I'm just going to have to do the work to do that, and I don't know. On the freedom idea, so I mean, we can often be self-deceived about our freedom. And the interesting thing about, say, like, I'll just use the Uber drivers, for example, is the fact that is the debate, the discussion. I mean, that are they independent contractors? Are they actually employees? Right? And the debate should actually remind us that that being an employee is not great. Right? Being an employee sucks, and so maybe we should look at the independent contractor thing less as an actual freedom than as a critique of the awfulness of being an employee. Like, there's really good, some really great interviews that have been done with a lot of different drivers. And some of them are saying, like, what was the guy's name? Travis Kalanick. Is that the right way I'm pronouncing it? Roughly, who was the founder of Uber. And he called all the drivers supply. And one of the things that during the debate over, was it Prop 20? The debate over that, someone was interviewing workers, and someone's like, look, Travis Kalanick already just thinks of his supply, like, how much better is my life going to be if I'm his employee than on my own? Both of them are bad. So I think that we have to keep in mind that we use the categories that are available to us, and that doesn't mean that we are the best any of us are the best interpreters of our, of our experience. Like, I don't know, we all think of, like, oh, academic work is so wonderful and great. Like, very few of us can make a living off of what we write, right? Like, so we're doing that work, much of it for free. Or maybe I'm not alone on that one. I don't know. Okay, so I think I answered that. I'm trying to be brief to let everybody have a chance. Okay, who is up?
Hi, I'm Daniel. I'm a humanities teaching fellow here, and I have a question. So I'm very sympathetic to your thesis, and I'm wondering why are so many Marxists so hostile towards it? And I'll say what I mean by that. I don't take the thesis to be anti-Marxist. In a way, it's kind of ultra-Marxist.
Yeah.
In a way which I'm also sympathetic towards, namely, what we're talking about basically is the distinction between rents for accessing assets, so fees for assets, versus profits for commodities on production. Marx didn't only write Volume 1, he also wrote Volume 3. And so Netflix, Spotify, Amazon Prime, Divvy Bikes, Zipcars, Google, Facebook, these are not profits for commodities, they're fees for assets which are gate-kept. And so the primacy of rent over profits is what we're talking about. And that means, the rent to profit ratio is increasing. So that is very Marxist. Smith would also countenance that, by the way. And so I just wonder, maybe the world has changed in a way that Marx didn't foresee, but we can still understand it in a Marxian way. Why are Marxists so hostile to this?
What was your name again?
Daniel.
Daniel, thanks.
Thank you so much. I'll be super quick. My name is Jack. I'm a graduate student in sociology at Northwestern. My question is about global periphery relations. So where you kind of started was in this qualification of the more Wallerstein type view about violence being intrinsic to capitalism. And I take it part of your argument was that what it buys us is a kind of tighter logic of capitalism that will help us delineate between changes over time. And part of me is wondering, though, if part of the perspective on violence and capitalism is about explaining variation over place. And I feel like part of where your neofeudalism ended up in the end was portrayed the development of feudalism relatively homogenously across the globe, that, the poorest countries would similarly experience this kind of feudal proletarianization as in the richest countries. And I'm wondering if you think that's true, or if there is uneven flows, and particularly I'm wondering how you're thinking about empire here and kind of global extraction. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Jie Ming. I'm a PhD student in the East Asian Studies department here. Thanks for your talk and your answers just now. I wonder if you could situate this critique of neofeudalism in relation to, Marxist feminism, social reproduction theory, because, the ever-expanding service economy is, what social reproduction feminists have been talking about. This, the kind of labor and activities that does not count toward the accumulation of surplus value. And I also wondered, because we were talking about this commodification thing, right? I think there's a strand of Marxist feminism that's actually very critical of, a certain kind of leftist anti-commodification thesis. For example, in Sophie Lewis' Full Surrogacy Now, there's the argument that, to roll back the commodification of gestational labor is not what communists should want. Instead, we should seek, the dialectical aspect of that commodification, which is, we can see a collectivizing of this labor through that commodification instead of rolling it back to the individual family. So I wondered how all of this might be related to, the critique of neo-feudalism. Thank you.
I know I'm the fourth person.
Oh, is there?
I'm Wolfgang. I'm a PhD student here in cinema and media studies. And first of all, thank you so much for this talk. It was incredible. And I wanted to kind of touch on some questions that have been asked already, but from a different angle. I think one of the kind of provocations of the term neofeudalism, or especially techno-feudalism, is the juxtaposition of this kind of thing that feels very old, connected to soil and land, and something that feels very hyper-modern, like smartphones or something. And so all of these forms of kind of work and labor that we see here are somewhat dependent on something like social media, to devices, to platforms. And I know this gets kind of into what work writes, but if feudalism, as you say, is about, as we've talked about, has these things like fealty and personal bonds, and that gets depersonalized with capitalism through markets, is something now that's necessary for neo-feudalism something like computation? And then if that is true, would this demand a kind of social history of computation, not just a technological one, and sort of require a broad theorizing of computation? So, thank you.
Okay, great. So I got to go in reverse. Is that your project?
No.
Because I think that's a really interesting question. I don't have an answer about the computation, but I think it'd be interesting to read it and see, and for someone to do that work. So on the Marxist feminism stuff, there's a lot of this argument that is very much involved in discussions of Marxist feminism. I'll just pinpoint one aspect of it, namely the debate on whether or not care work is value-producing labor. I don't think it is. And I think that's and I think we can stand on that in a good way to criticize capitalism. You don't have to claim that it's value-producing labor. There's actually a fantastic debate in the late 30s, early 40s in the Communist Party of the CPUSA on this. And everybody, there's Kate Wigen in, what's it called, Red Feminism, discusses it. The names of the players in it just left my head, but anyway, so the orthodox CP view was it's necessary, but it's not value-producing labor. That's part of the problem, and I think we need to expand that aspect of it rather than try to claim everything within the terms of capitalism. Why would we want to do that? We want to get rid of capitalism. So on let me go next to Daniel. Why are they so hostile to it? One answer I have comes from when I was at this sort of summer event. What do they call? What was it called? Like Marxism 2022 or something like that. It's done by SWP in London. They always have it like in July. And Varoufakis was kind of the big talking head coming in on a screen because he wasn't there in person. And the commentator was really, really very, trot and very hostile to the neofeudalism thesis or techno-feudalism thesis, because he's like, if you say this means that you do not think that the industrial labor force is the where we organize. And we can't go that. We can't abandon that. And so I think part of it is, part of my explicit thing is we have to think of service sector workers. That's where the economy is going. That's where the workers are. Right? So, but I think the hostility is and I think this actually goes into gendered and race preconceptions about what the working class looks like. So I think it has to do with this still a hold on thinking about a particular vision of the industrial working class. That's my best guess for it. You want to follow up? Pardon?
Dogmatism.
Yeah, it seems so mean to say that. Because I don't think the people think of it that way, but I think that's where it anchors into. I mean, also, I don't know, McKinsey work is just like, why are you using an old term? Like when we've had different discussions, like why not say something new? I'm like, in part, like their actual, people during the Uber, during the struggle around, Uber and Lyft and Deliveroo in California, the people who are organizing out there were using the language of we're all serfs now. It's bucking feudalism all over again. That's in their speeches. Right? So I think if the language is coming out of movements, then we can use that language, and we should use that language rather than make up something like this, like, I don't know, whatever they want to make up. But that's where I find that compelling. And then to Jack. So, yeah. So it's a hard question, because like, what do we mean when homogeneous at one level, heterogeneous at another level? And I think it's hard to, like, I agree, like, I want to have both at the same time. I want to be able to say there are dynamics that are uniform, and that in specific contexts, they will realize themselves in different ways. So yeah, that's the way I want to answer. I think we've got a set of dynamics, and then we can see how they are realized on the ground in different histories, in different economies, in different ecologies, in different spatialities. They will take different places, but capitalism's also been that way, right? Like capitalism is also, it has elements that are highly homogenizing and elements that are also differentiating. Okay, did anybody get left out? No? We're only 6 minutes over. Okay.